Yes, thank you. If I can add anything to Ambassador's presentation, probably it is about the brief comment on the value of ASEAN from Japan's perspective, how and why valuable the ASEAN is. The ASEAN countries occupied a significant position in the global value chain, particularly in the machinery industry, right? Auto and auto parts. Yeah. It's machine, it's a mechanical things, but I think when it comes to digital, it's a totally different scenario, right? So let me show some slides I prepared. This is about the data flow. So we have seen export and import of goods in the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. So we are sort of obsessed with the trade. The concept of trade is always good and service, but we have to think about data flow. And looking at this, China's data flow in and out it's far beyond the U.S. one. I picked up this data from Nikkei, written by a very strong investigative reporters team in digital economy. It says China now accounts for 23% of cross-border global data, and twice bigger than the U.S. one. And where the data runs, here you go. Well, the U.S. accounted for 40% of data flow in and out of China in 2001, but now it's dropped to just 25%. Instead, the Asian countries in Southeastern Asian countries now make up more than half, particularly Vietnam and Singapore, which means data flows between China and Southeast Asia. What does this mean? The source of Beijing's power in the region lies in connection with Southeast Asia. And China became a global data superpower. It will control huge quantity of resources that will inevitable. It's very valuable to economic competitiveness. So we have to think about the source of the economic competitiveness, which is not just raw material or technology, but the data, intangible assets of the economy. So data from foreign sources can provide an edge, a competitive edge of AI. Naturally, you can imagine that the more company or the government accumulated data, the smarter AI they can develop, right? So this is a story of intangible economic resource. But what about hardware? As Ambassador mentioned before, this is data, but there has to be a hardware which can be fundamentals of data flow, which is of course the semiconductor. So there's a huge demand of semiconductors, even immense demands for semiconductors. So we have to take a look at how it works globally. This one is something I made from the data obtained from my friend in the industry. As Ambassador mentioned, just briefly, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 steps, basically 7 or 8 steps of the value adding process. And one is, okay, this is a device. Top of the line is a device. So the market size is quite big, and the US occupies about 50%. And design software, which is automatic software you have to use in order to design the semiconductor pattern. And US, there's 3 major companies who occupies the market. The 90% is dominated by the US. And IP core license, this is sort of a intellectual property of design of each blocks on the chips and small blocks. And you have to, the whole chip is composed by the several and many the blocks, and each blocks have the license. They have to provide it by somebody. And each one is provided by the US company and EU. This is British Arms, which is now acquired by the US company. And the wafer, this is the wafer, is mostly provided by Japan, 57%. Well, the best known company's name is Kagaku, right? And a foundry. This is quite important. I think this is the choking point of the whole value chain of semiconductor. The Taiwan, TSMC, is a superpower. Yeah, you can take a picture of this. I made it. And 71% is Taiwan, and the second largest foundry is Taiwan as well. And they are mostly located in Taiwan, and they have some factories in China as well. And the packaging, testing, so they have to nearby the foundry, so they are mostly located in Taiwan, 54%, and China. And equipment, this is another choking point of value chain of semiconductor. To manufacture the semiconductor, you need to have some equipments, top-notch equipment, which is produced by the U.S., such as Applied Materials and others, and the Japanese, Tokyo Electron and others. So look at this, the U.S. still occupies most of the value chain. So, and EU, and as mentioned before, the biggest one in the ARM in London was acquired by the U.S. So U.S. quietly occupies all the steps of the value chain, and Japan is losing its ground. But we have to think about Taiwan. Taiwan has everything about the fabrication. And TSMC is more like a superpower of this whole value chain. And they have the factories in Taiwan. And that's why the Trump administration wanted to force them to come over to Arizona to set up their top-notch factory. So this is quite understandable why the US has to do it. And China, of course, naturally doesn't want to release the factory out of China. And I gather that TSMC is sort of struggling and being sandwiched by the US and China, and they have no other options to follow the US. So we have to think about Taiwan, and we tend to forgotten about Taiwan in the trade policy. It's quite important geographically, and the location in geographic location of Taiwan is a big concern, especially after having witnessed what happened in Hong Kong this year. That's why the US is keen to force TSMC to come over, and Japan has no free trade agreement, neither does the US or any other big nations, neither do RCEP or TPP-11. Singapore has, by the way, you have FTA with Taiwan. Very smart move, I think. Now, I was based in Tokyo covering foreign affairs around the year 2000 when ASEAN and Japan agreed on the FTA. And I remember the introduction of the concept of the accumulation into the rules of origin was quite breakthrough. You know, there's no such things like a made in Vietnam, made in Thailand anymore. So it's just say made in ASEAN. This is a kind of big steps, I think. But it's a story of more than 10 years ago when trading goods and tariff reduction is very important at the time. But now we are living in a digitization, digital transformation era, right? So we have to think about how we can rearrange the trade policy to adjust ourselves to the digital economy. Well, even after the Biden administration is established, the US and China will continue to be at odds. I'm sure about that in the various fronts. But I still believe that the stronger relationship between Japan and ASEAN can be can play a good role in terms of the stability of the region. And China wants to hoist its flag in ASEAN. And Japan tend to think that Japan is the best friend of ASEAN. Everybody want to be the friend of ASEAN, right? So the EU is approaching to try to entrench their economic legal system in ASEAN and technical standard certification. And I believe that the ASEAN, most of the ASEAN nations are under influence of the EU system, legal system. And the US has become aware that they need to show their strong presence in the region to counter China. And actually, it was Monday, a national security advisor to the U.S. President, Mr. O'Brien, gave us a press briefing online. And he stated, he issued a statement from Manila American Cemetery, where the war victims are buried. And he said, we should not repeat the tragedy of World War II. And he said, basically, we are here in the region for the sake of regional stability. So he knows he's working for Mr. Trump, but he is very aware of the transition of administration. And he basically thinks no matter who is going to be the president of the US, we are here in the region. And another connotation, of course, is don't forget what Japan did 75 years ago. So the ASEAN is very popular, and everybody has to be creative when it comes to the policy toward ASEAN. I think the foreign policy toward the US from a Japanese perspective, the policy towards Japan, toward the US and China will determine by itself in a sense. But when it comes to the ASEAN policy, we have to be very creative in the midst of the U.S. China conflict. So, ahead of the coming of the Biden administration, the Suga government is currently restructuring the foreign policy in a hurry. So we have to see what's going to happen. The Minister Wang came to Japan yesterday and had a meeting with Mr. Motegi. And I saw the Minister Motegi was smiling with some sort of shyness. And I imagine Mr. Wang brought some message from Beijing. It's very quick move, They have immediately started the liberalization of the traffic of the human people between two nations in this month, in November. We have only 4 or 5 days, but they have already started the process. So China is moving forward to establish a new relationship with Japan. I don't know what it is. So my question to the ambassador is, what should we do toward ASEAN? You said you were not quite clear what is the next step in ASEAN, but I'm interested in having said that the supply chain and the value chain of digitalization, which is different from the pattern in the 20th century, and in order to move up to the high end and to make a more integration between the ASEAN and Japan, what should be done? I mean, Thailand is known as a place for the auto manufacturing place, which is a manufacturing place. But the Japanese company have subsidiaries there for more than 30, 40 years. And a technological transfer is made significantly. But yes.
Excuse me. We are running out of the time.
All right. Okay.
Could you wrap up your question? And
question is about how the ASEAN can move up to the high end to build a new value chain with Japan.
I think the short answer to your question, Ms. Ota, is something I mentioned. The way ASEAN works, each individual ASEAN member will have to improve conditions in their own economies first, or perhaps at the same time as improving conditions regionally, right? And as you know, the conditions are very uneven in different ASEAN countries. And probably the pandemic will make it even more uneven. So this is a problem. And the crucial factor is the domestic politics of various countries. What can they do realistically given the politics? There is a first step taken. I think the fact I mentioned it, the common rules of origin can help flows between, say, Japan and things, but that's, as you said, it's the traditional trade, right? To encourage the more digital flows, we have to improve conditions in our own countries. The human conditions. Do we have the human skills? Do we have the hard infrastructure? You do need some hard infrastructure for data flows too. Do we need all this? I think the answer is we are still lacking. Perhaps Singapore is ahead of some others, but even we need to do more. All right. One point I think you asked about Japan's role. Look, the US is always going to have a big problem in the entire Indo-Pacific. The US is an offshore balancer. An offshore balancer always has this problem. If it is too assertive, people fear getting entangled in their quarrels.
True.
If it is too quiet, people fear being abandoned. And I see actually Japan's role as very important in evening out this oscillation between fear of entanglement and fear of abandonment. Because why? Because Japan is part of the region, the broader region. It's not in Southeast Asia, but it has an enormous role in Southeast Asia. You are the anchor of the US in the entire region, the US-Japan alliance. And you play, under Mr. Abe, an extremely important complementary role to the US role. I hope you will continue to play that role under Mr. Suga. In fact, he has said he will, and that's very encouraging that he went to Vietnam and Indonesia as his first trip.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you, Ota-san, for your very valuable comments and questions, especially on the role of Japan. And if I may, I'm going to pose Ambassador one question from the audience. What do you think are the 3 specific risks in Asia, if you name them, in the context of U.S. China conflict?
First of all, I think you're talking about, let me talk about geopolitical risk first. I think the biggest geopolitical risk is without doubt Taiwan, in the Taiwan Straits. I don't think China is looking for a war, but as I mentioned in my opening remarks, this is not a claim that China can ever renounce, any Chinese government, right? And they have been a bit more assertive recently, though not as assertive as in 1995, 1996. Right, that is without doubt the biggest risk. The second risk is in the South China Sea. The risk there is of accident. I don't think it's a very high risk, but it does exist. Similarly in Senkaku, right? I think actually in Senkaku and South China Sea, if there's an accident, it will be, everybody will try their best to quickly contain the fallout. But in Taiwan, the Taiwan Straits is a different issue. Things can easily get out of hand. The second risk is one that emerged, and I think Mr. Ota did allude to it. Because when he talked about data flows between China and Southeast Asia, and China and the rest of the world. I think the risk is that unless the US moves quickly, which I don't think will happen, but quickly is a relative term, to re-establish itself as a multilateral trade player, we may get locked into path dependencies with China. Nobody wants it, by the way, and I don't think the risk is very high because people are aware of it and they are trying to find alternatives, trying to hedge and balance. But the US is the crucial factor. The US is a crucial factor geopolitically. The US is a crucial factor economically, with Japan as a very close second close factor for the economic balancing. But there is this risk that, you know, unless the US re-engages quickly, relatively quickly, path dependencies could develop. The third risk is, I think, a psychological risk. We should not, I said it's important that we should see China as a whole, its strength as well as its weakness. And I was alluding to the psychological risk, because competition is not just material. Competition is also psychological. There is a strong strain of Chinese propaganda to make you adopt a fatalistic attitude. You have no choice. It's only China. There is always a choice. Right? So we must not get into this fatalistic frame of mind. We should not. I saw it very dangerously during the Trump administration, because he did many things wrong. But that's why I kept insisting that not everything he did was wrong. Certain things he did much better than Obama. So we should not give up on the US. It's a different US, but it's still there. The US is not going to leave this region. Its engagement of this region will change, and countries like Japan, Australia, India will have to take up some of the slack. And you are already doing so, right? But we'll have to see more of that. So the psychological risk is the most intangible, but the most dangerous in a way. Because if you get into a wrong frame of mind, the way you frame your policies, the way you see your options will narrow artificially, and then you will get stuck into the path dependencies that I talked about a moment ago.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And now it's time to close our webinar. I'd like to thank you again, Ambassador Bilahari, for very insightful and deep observation. Thank you again for sharing your time. And I also would like to thank Ota-san for very valuable comments and on current topics, including data and digitalization of the economy. Thank you, both of you, for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. So now we are closed.